welcome you all back as we continue our series called 10 Commandments in 10 weeks. And we are on commandment number 2, which is the having no graven images or created images that we should bow down to or worship. And we're going to talk in detail about what that means this evening. As we get started, though, I think it's good for us to go back and just have a quick review of what we looked at last week so we can get the whole context of what this is about. So first of all, just a reminder, last week in our first session, we talked about, first of all, the importance of the 10 Commandments. What's the big deal about the 10 Commandments? Well, first of all, they come from God, and it's just before the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20 and verse 1, it says, "And God spoke all these words." These are the words of God. Not only did he speak the words, but it was the finger of God that recorded them on the tablets of stone. The actual finger of God recording these instructions, these 10 Commandments. So first of all, they come from God, and so just from that standpoint, God speaks, we should listen up. You know, if remember that old commercial when E.F. Hutton speaks, people listen. Well, if we listen for E.F. Hutton, how much more should we listen for God? So the next one is, and that should say Exodus 20 in verse 1 on the screen, on the slide there. Secondly, they provide an objective standard of right and wrong. And so the idea is, who calls the shots in our lives? Is it the majority rule? Sometimes the majority gets it wrong. Is it our feelings? Our feelings are always real, but our feelings are not always right. Going by the 10 Commandments, it is allowing God to be in his place and saying, okay, God, you call the shots on life and morality, and I'll trust your guidance and your wisdom. Through these 10 Commandments, God provides for us and protects. Again, the idea is you take God out of the equation. What if we just lived by these and there was no thought of God, but we just lived by these as best as possible? Do you think we'd have a better society or a worse society? We would have a better society just because these are things that are just plain wisdom that provide and protect for us and protect us. And then they are recognized by Jews and Christians alike as the greatest moral code ever given to mankind. And all of our laws, you go back, you can trace them back to these 10 commands. So, how did we get to these 10 commandments? And so I'm just starting from the book of Exodus in the days of Moses. And so we started with, in Exodus chapter 12, the Israelites escaped slavery in Egypt, and you can see that they were in Egypt. They'd been there for 400 years, had been made slaves during that time, and so God sends them out. There was the miracle of the Passover. Then there was Exodus 14, the miracle of the Red Sea. So you see these miraculous things. God is guiding them with a cloud by day and a fire by night. This was quite an impressive thing. He miraculously leads them through the Red Sea on dry ground. Then they make their way up to Mount Sinai. Here, this cloud that was guiding them by day and night rests on top of Mount Sinai. And it's not just a mist or a fog. It is thunder on the mountain. We think of this hurricane that's down in Florida right now and how intimidating that is. This was shaking the entire mountain, just shaking it. And to the point where the people of God were scared. They were just frightened. They were told not to approach the mountain. But Moses was told to go up onto the mountain. And he was with them. And while he was there with God, God gave him the 10 Commandments. And they're recorded in Exodus chapter 20. Now, we read all of them last week, the whole passage here. But tonight we'll just first of all, we'll look at the first commandment here. Then we talked about last week the first commandment in Exodus 20, verses 2 through 3. Of course, the first verse says, and God spoke all these words. And then in verse 2, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He's given his credentials. I am the Lord your God. I'm sovereign over all these things. I'm also your Savior. I brought you out of Egypt. We saw in that map. Brought you out of slavery, brought you across the Red Sea. Now you're going to listen to me. And then verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. So what does this imply, or what does this demand? So this commandment demands that we have, first of all, a belief in God. And so you shall have no other gods. So you must have a God, which is, but you can have no other God before the one true God. So it demands a belief in God. It demands a belief in one God. Of course, there's all of this polytheism and pantheism. Polytheism means belief in many gods. Pantheism means that just everything's God. This kind of the New Age type stuff, which is just really old age mysticism and paganism. So there's the belief in God, belief in one God. And then there's the belief in the one true God. Now this overlaps with what we're talking about tonight with the don't bow down to idols or no graven images. It demands an inward loyalty. It is the one God. I worship God and God alone. There is nobody else that comes before him. And also an outward allegiance. Later on in the Old Testament, it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Of course, they were also obeying the second command, not to bow down to any idols, but they weren't going to put any other God before their one true God. And it showed in their actions. So inward loyalty, outward allegiance, all of the other commands flow from this. It's kind of like the illustration I heard, I think it was put this way. Somebody asked, well, how can you believe in miracles? How can you believe in the resurrection? How can you believe a man was swallowed by a fish and then, and spit out? So how was that? Well, if you can believe Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you can believe everything else. And so if you believe and go by and accept this first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me, all the other commandments flow out of that. So this brings us to the second commandment here. No graven images or idols. All right, so let's read this here. Exodus 20, beginning in verse 4. And so this is, we put it down to just one sentence. You shall have do not make any graven images. But there's really a whole paragraph here, and there's a lot to unpack in this. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on the earth, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So there's a lot to unpack in here, and we will take our time and do that here. So first of all, some might say, well, doesn't it kind of seem that these first two commandments are repeating each other? They're kind of redundant a little bit. No other gods before me. That would just imply you're not going to bow down to any idols. So here is a little bit, if you want to write this on your outline as well. The first commandment that we talked about last week is about having the correct priority. That means that God is before all. God is our first priority in all things. The second commandment is about having the correct worship. In other words, there can be no substitutes for God. Whatever God designs, the devil has a way of distorting. God will design whatever God creates, he exists. We are to worship him. But the devil will come along and try to get us to go along with a substitute or something that's just not quite the same. I remember when I was a kid, I don't know if my mother will remember this or not, but do you remember on television there used to be these ads where you could buy a record album and it would be a compilation of all the greatest, latest hits. Now you just do it on your phones, but you'd buy this record album and it looked great. And so I think I saved some money up and I said, I want to get that. I liked all those hits. And they were advertising them, they rolled them one after another and played them. And so I got this record album in, and actually it was one of those double albums. And so I just started playing it and we had one of those old record players. It was a big piece of furniture. The big giant, you had one of those and you put the needle down and you hear that little crackle. And then all of a sudden I was listening, it was the latest hits, all compiled into two discs. It was 2 albums, vinyl albums. And I'm listening to it, and something's off. I'm like, what is this? And I was trying to think. It was these hits from probably the 70s or something. I think, what is this? And here, what had happened was the company that was selling these albums did not really have the rights to the original songs. So they'd hired musicians to come in and recreate all the songs. And so it was just kind of a lame version of all these songs, And so I got ripped off. That's what the devil wants to do with our worship. There's something that just looks so flashy. You see the advertisement, oh, I want that. And you reach out for it, and then you start playing it or worshiping, and you realize something's off here. This is not the real thing. And so so that was kind of funny. I just remember that. I was like, something's not right. These are like lame counterfeits. So the devil would want us to worship lame counterfeits of the one true God, and mankind has fallen prey to that over the years. All right, so moving on in our outline here. So going back to the time when the 10 Commandments were first introduced, you need to understand the culture and the time of that day. So you had the gods of the Egyptians, where they had come from, and then you have the gods of the Canaanites, where they were going. They were going to the land of Canaan. That was the promised land. And all throughout these nations, all throughout these places, there were people who were given to all kinds of paganistic worship here. So I've got some pictures here. Now, I'm going to try to pronounce these. So these are some of the Egyptian gods and goddesses that were worshipped by the Egyptian people. And so I'm going to butcher these names, but that's okay. They're not real gods anyway. Okay, so go through here. If you look up there on the picture there, you've got Osiris is the god of justice, Isis, the god of motherhood, Horus, the god of sky, Nephthys, the god of funerals, Anubis, the god of death, and then there's Atum and Ra, which are kind of the same. It's the sun god. And then there's Thoth, Thoth, the god of intellect, Hathor, the goddess of drunkenness, Geb, the god of earth, and Nut, the goddess of earth, and then Shu, which is the god of air, which I think that probably just sounds like Shu, sounds like air. Shu, the god of air. Tefnut is the creator of Shu. So, and then Ptah, the god of Memphis, not the one where Elvis was born, but the one in Egypt. And then Sobek, god of the Nile. In Ma'at, the goddess of truth, justice, balance, and order. So you've got all of these gods, and they had images, and they would worship these images, whether it be a picture or a statue. Now, think about this. Think about the plagues of Egypt. What did God attack in the plagues of Egypt? One of the things that God attacked was the Nile. Showing that Sobek, the god of the Nile, not a god at all. He had dominance over the god of the Nile. What about the god of the air? You know, when the locusts came in and the gnats came in, you know, there's the goddess of air, the god of air, Shu, and so they were saying Shu quite a bit when the locusts and the gnats came in. There was the sun god Ra. God darkened the sun. Goddess of motherhood. You have that. The death of the firstborn, as horrible as that is, God is in control of all the things. And Anbus, the god of death. You know, they thought that they created these gods. They were worshiping them, but God was dominant over all of them. So those are the gods of Canaan, and they had come from the 400 years living in that god of Canaan of Egypt. 400 years living there. Be tempting to say, okay, well, I believe in the one true God, but you know what? I need it to be sunny today, so maybe I'll pray to Ra too, or one of the different ones, or you know, I'd like to have a child. I'm going to pray to that God of motherhood. Or I want to call down justice on somebody. I'm going to pray to the God of death. God is saying, you shall have no other gods before me, no graven images. Don't do this. So then there are, on top of where they were coming from, the Egyptian idols, there are the Canaanite idols, the gods of Canaan. Now these are just two. And so you have on the left there, you'll see the goddess Baal, and you hear that. I'm sure these terms might sound familiar. There's Asherah and Baal. So Baal was the primary god of the Canaanite fertility cults. Now I'm going to read a quote here. This is from the series That the World May Know. So Baal's worshippers appeased him by offering sacrifices, usually animals such as sheep or bulls. Some scholars believe that the Canaanites also sacrificed pigs and that God prohibited his people from eating pork in part to prevent this horrible cult from being established among them. So that might have been some of the reason for the kosher dietary restrictions. And here's the key. At times of crisis, Baal's followers sacrificed their children, apparently the firstborn of the community, to gain personal prosperity. So there you have the evil practice. It wasn't just that they were bowing down to a statue. It was the activities that came along with it. And then there were other gods too. Moloch, which is, again, people sacrificing their children to Moloch. And you see, even the children of Israel, eventually, they gave in. They had a pattern of idol worship. So then that brings us to the other one area of Asherah. And I looked around for a statue that I could put up there of an Asherah figure that would be appropriate to put on the screen, because many of them are inappropriate to look at. So Asherah was worshipped in various ways. Now this is, again, I'm reading here, this is a quote from That the World May Know curriculum. Asherah was the fertility goddess. Asherah was worshipped in various ways, including through ritual sex. Although she was believed to be Baal's mother, she was also his mistress. Pagans practiced sympathetic magic. That is, they believed they could influence the god's actions by performing the behavior they wished the gods to demonstrate. Believing the sexual union of Baal and Asherah produced fertility, their worshippers engaged in immoral sex to cause the gods to join together, ensuring good harvest. So this was the thinking in their mind. This practice became the basis for religious prostitution. A priest or a male member of the community represented Baal. The priestess or female members of the community represented Asherah. In this way, God's incredible gift of sexuality was perverted to the most obscene public prostitution. And so you have sacrifice of children, you have, and again, whatever God creates, designs, the devil distorts. And even when it comes to sexuality and sexual behavior, and we see it was really prevalent here with Baal, worship of Baal, and worship of Asherah. So this gives a little more insight as you go into the New Testament in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 21 through 25. I'll read this here. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Isn't that, it's just, now Paul is just in general describing the way of human nature. Mark Twain, who I believe is also quoting another philosopher, I'm not sure how, but he put it this way: God created man in his image, and man returned the favor. I think it's a good way to put it there. So, with that in mind here, let's just talk about let's go back to the command again, that second commandment, and see what it says there. Exodus 20 and verse 4. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. So, what's the big deal? What's the big deal about making a statue and saying, hey, I'm going to pray to this? Okay, well, first of all, graven images misrepresent the nature of God. So I've got a few little things you can write in your outline there. What do we know about the nature of God? Well, one thing we know about the nature of God, the God of the Bible, is this, is that he is separate from all created things. The first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. So God was first, and then what did God do next? In the beginning, God created. He was there separate, then he created. He is separate from created things, which when you worship an idol, that's a created thing, and so that is not the true God. He is over all created things. This was demonstrated very dramatically in the 10 plagues in Egypt. When God turned the Nile to blood, they worshiped frogs, the plague of frogs, the gnats, the locusts. All of those things were showing that these were not true gods at all, but that God is preeminent, is sovereign over all created things. He is over all of them. So, in being so, that means he is all-powerful. Now, the theology word for that is omnipotent, but he is all-powerful. And so, each nation would have their set of gods, and they thought that maybe their gods were more powerful than the other nations. But God would override them all. He is all powerful. He doesn't come to, or Tony Evans made a statement one time, God doesn't come to take sides, he comes to take over. And so he is all powerful. He is also all knowing. God has all wisdom, all knowledge, all of those things, and his ways are higher than our ways. And so because of that, we can trust his insights and his ways. And so all-knowing means omniscient. So there's all-powerful, omnipotent, all-knowing, omniscient, and he is also in all places. He is omnipresent. And so that means that there is no place you can go to hide from the Lord or to be away from his presence. And there's some times that maybe we can't sense God's presence or feel it, but he is there in all places. And finally, he is beyond comprehension. God refuses to even give himself a name that can be contained in our human understanding. You know, it's kind of like you probably heard that old joke about the kid in Sunday school that raised his hand and said, "Teacher, I know what God's name is." And the teacher said, "What do you mean you know his name?" She goes, "Yeah, his name is Andy." He says, "Where'd you get that?" He goes, "Well, we sing about it every Sunday. Andy walks with me, Andy talks with me, and he tells me I am his." So that kid was confused there. What does God say that his name is? It's on the screen there. I am. Moses said, "What name do I give you when I go to Pharaoh?" I am. Existence itself. In other words, I'm not going to tell you a name. Just tell him I am said to go. So understanding that, how does Jesus fit into this? Jesus fulfills all of those above requirements that we just saw. Jesus is separate from all created things. He wasn't just created in the manger. He existed from beginning of creation. Father, Son, Holy Spirit existed from the beginning. He is over all created things. He is all powerful. He demonstrated all those things. He is all knowing. He showed he had insight and knowledge that only the divine could have. And now he is in all places. Although for that time he made himself in human form, but he is not limited by geography. And even today, he gave us that promise. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He is in all places. And also, he is also beyond comprehension. He is beyond what we can imagine. When he was transfigured before Peter, James, and John, all of a sudden, they had an insight into who they had been with. What's this about? They didn't know what to do except for to fall on their knees. Peter tried to build some tents and respond in some meager human ways. But Jesus is beyond comprehension. So you think about that. That's the one true God. Okay? So I paint that picture to show a contrast with Isaiah chapter 44, 9 through 20. Here the prophet Isaiah goes into great detail about idols. So think about all the stuff of God. And now let's make a contrast with this. All right. Isaiah 44, 9 through 20. This is a long passage. I'm just going to read it out. All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit nothing? People who do that will be put to shame. Such craftsmen are only human beings. Let them all come together and take their stand. They will be brought down to terror and shame. The blacksmith takes a tool and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. He gets hungry and loses his strength. He drinks no water and grows faint. The carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline with a marker. He roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in human form in all its glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine in the rain and made it grow. It is used as fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. But he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat. He eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm. I see the fire." From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." They know nothing. They understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. No one stops to think. No one has the knowledge or understanding to say, half of it I used for fuel. I even baked bread over its coals. I roasted meat and ate it. Shall I make a detestable thing from what is left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood? Such a person feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself or say, "Is not this thing in my right hand a lie?" Isn't that interesting? You see that comparing what the idol is. Why is this such a serious thing to bow down to the idol? And so Isaiah very eloquently, under the inspiration of God, spells out why we should not bow down to idols and why this is such an important thing. So this brings us to the next part of the command. More insights here, and this is probably going to bring some questions up. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. This is in Exodus 20:5 and 6. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. And here's the part that people stumble over. Punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So, what's the deal with this? So let's just talk a little bit about generational judgment. Is that really fair? What's going on here with that? So, this part of the passage is a stumbling block to some. Is it fair that the third and fourth generations be punished for the sins of their ancestors? Well, I have two ways we're going to look to make an explanation of what God is saying. He's just expressing a general truth as well here. First of all, there is a practical explanation. Many times, future generations deal with the harmful effects of the sinful actions of the previous generations. Now let me ask you, can you think of examples in modern times where future generations have had to deal with horrible consequences from what a previous generation had done? I think about this in terms of perhaps there was a previous generation that was not honest in their financial dealings, and then they ended up spending time in prison, and they ended their life bankrupt, and so they passed that poverty down to the next generation. It was their sin, but the children are being punished for that. Or perhaps what you see in very, very sad cases of somebody that's guilty of physical abuse. You know, that the physical abuse or abuse of the family members, that gets passed down from generation to generation oftentimes until somebody can break the cycle. Chemical abuse or sexual abuse, you think of the sins of the parents of one generation can have horrible, awful effects on the next generation. So, how does this apply to worshiping the idols? Well, I can think of a major Bible example where the sins of an older generation had a bad effect on the younger generation. So Israel did, over the centuries, give in to idol worship, and even to the point of worshiping Moloch and sacrificing their children in some of their darkest times. Finally, God allowed the nation of Israel to be taken captive and taken over into Babylonian captivity, captured by the Babylonians. There they were for 70 years. 70 years. Now, in that time, the Israelites did not worship any idols. That was the end of idol worship in Israel for the Jews. So 70 years. We got generations going by there. And they come back and they rebuild, but the temple is just not like it was before. So those younger generations dealt with they had to experience the punishment of what had happened the generations before. They hadn't bowed down to the idols, but they were dealing with the consequences. And so that's what was happening in that time. Now, there is also a literary explanation to this as well. And if you did our study on Revelation, this might make a little more sense as well. So I'm punishing to the 4th generation, but I'm blessing to the 1000th generation. So you can see that's kind of a language tool there. It's a language tool of making a comparison. So I will punish down to the 4th generation, but hey, if you obey this command, I'm going to bless to the 1000th generation. So you can look at it from that angle as well. But I think I think the answer to this is in both of these work together. I believe absolutely that practical explanation that we see that at work quite a bit there. So we're winding on down here, and so we're going to make some application. How do we apply this today? And there's many sermons that could be preached right here, but I won't preach them all right now. So the one application that can be made is simply this: be careful to never substitute the one true God for any man-made thing. Do not make any substitutions. No substitutes. Now, so what do we substitute for the one true God? Man-made objects. So first of all, if you want to fill in the blanks here, man-made objects, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means here, but here's 3 examples, and I'm going to add in a 4th one, and the 4th example is free. So on here, so you don't have to pay for that one. So the man-made objects is the first example. So sometimes we'll take an object and we will make that a substitute for our worship. And sometimes unintentionally, even something that is an innocent thing. I know I heard the account, maybe you've heard this story. There was a church that there was a big argument over. Some people wanted to change out the communion plates because they'd gotten older, but some of the people didn't want to do that because we've got this wonderful tradition. We want to hold on to these, and there was a big church fight over changing out the communion trays. So they fought over and over and over again, and finally, one day, nobody could find the communion trays. Somebody hid the old communion trays and put the new ones there, and nobody could find the old ones. They thought, had they been thrown away? Had they been thrown away? What happened to the old communion trays? And finally, another year went by, and somebody opened the door of the entrance to the baptistry, and they found the communion trays right in front of the baptistry. Now I don't know if that's a true story or not, but that just goes to show when you're getting so angry over that, they had made that object, even a communion tray, kind of an object of worship. So be careful not to make that an object of worship. There's man-made traditions. The best biblical illustration of this would have been the Pharisees. So the Pharisees, you had the commands of God, but what did they do? They added their own traditions to the commands of God. Now, initially, there was a good motive behind it. They wanted to make sure that nobody broke the commandments of God. So God said, obey the Sabbath. Well, we're going to make a bunch of traditions so that you don't break the Sabbath. There's no chance that you'll break the Sabbath. So we're going to add, well, what happened is their traditions became more important than the actual command itself. And plus, with adding new laws, every time you add a law, you can find a way to add a loophole to the law as well. So they came up with all these traditions, and their man-made traditions became an idol that they were worshiping over God. There's also man-made philosophies. What I found, and this is whether it is a left-leaning philosophy or a right-leaning philosophy, whenever you add something to the gospel, that thing tends to take over, whether it's to the right or to the left. This is my right, okay. To the right or to the left. Whatever it is, or what kind of philosophy it is, if you say, well, let's have the gospel plus let's add this little bit of stuff in here with it. Eventually, the thing that you add, like yeast, takes over. And so we have to constantly be saying, let's just go back to what the Bible says, or the Bible speaks, we speak, or the Bible is silent, we're silent. And I would add one more in here. This is the free one. I don't have a blank here. Man-made experiences I would put into there. Now, out here at Legend Valley, every now and then they'll have these big music festivals. We had one here just recently. And what you find, though, is a lot of times, sometimes people are going just to hear music or whatever, but sometimes people are going because they want to get caught up in an experience. And they are bowing down to the experience as if it's a religious thing almost. They won't call it that, but they want to get that high, they want to get that, and then there's all kinds of things that go along with that wouldn't be honoring to God. So be careful to not let man-made objects, traditions, philosophies, experiences, you can think about it. You put the word man-made and then something, that's something that can be worshipped. Even something that God has commanded man to make can end up being worshipped. You might remember there was a time when the Israelites were traveling in the desert, and God caused a plague of snakes to come along, and because they had disobeyed him, and they said, well, if you want to be freed from this plague, God said you need to make an image of a snake and hold that up and have the people look at it, the serpent, that is, I should say. And that's where we get the symbol for healing, for hospitals and all of that. You look to that. And so God used that as a tool. He told them to use that, but it wasn't to be worshipped. He just says, just do this. But what happened? Eventually, they took that man-made object and they began to worship it. God had them grind it into dust, put it into the water, and they even drank it. They said, I want you to get rid of that thing. So they got rid of it here. So be careful to never substitute the one true God for any man-made thing. So that brings us to the conclusion of lesson number 2, no graven images. And next week we'll look at showing the proper respect to God's name and not misusing the name of God.